Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Atheist Uprising. Tonight, we're going to have a fantastic debate between two individuals. One whose name is Scott Williamson, and he is my co host for this show. And the other is a friend of Scott Williamson's, who is Alejandro. And Alejandro and Scott are going to debate, does a personal Almighty God exist? Now, before we go into this, I do want to thank our Patreon supporters, Linear and TART, for helping us do what we love doing, which is creating videos for you, the viewer. And before we commence, we're actually going to put down how the debate is going to work. So in the beginning, the introduction is going to be 5 minutes each. Then there's going to be rebuttals to the introduction, which is going to be another 5 minutes each. And then there's going to be a 30-minute exchange between the two. After that, the last 15 minutes is going to be from the comment section. Any questions and everything like that will be brought forward from the comment section, and both of our interlocutors will answer questions that are directed to them or just general questions in and of themselves. So without further ado, I would like to bring forth these two individuals. Thank you very much for coming, Alejandro and Scott Williamson. Thank you so much for coming on the Atheist Uprising to have this wonderful debate. Thank you very much. So, before we commence, which one of you would want to go first?
Either way, it works for me. I know Alejandro's going to be making the positive claim. Usually they go first, but I'm open to whatever the case is.
Right.
All right. So he wants me to go first. I'll be happy to do that. All right. So the question is a personal God. Would you go ahead and we can agree to that? Does a personal God exist? Is that I want to be clear on that before we move forward.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is you're going to argue for the personal God. I am going to argue that a personal God is not necessary at all.
It's not necessary. Okay.
Right.
All right, so the argument actually breaks up into a few parts. The one is the existence of God, and the second is the nature of God. And these are two different arguments. The existence of God is established by the cosmological argument, of which there are several versions. The one that I prefer is the one I authored, which is the argument from contingency, which is the idea that things are either necessary or contingent, and we know the cosmos is contingent. Ergo, it's contingent on a cosmos creator. This establishes the existence of God. Now, as far as the self-awareness of God, this is established through the fine-tuning argument. Okay, so we look at the cosmos and we find that it is suitable for life and therefore designed, and design includes a designer, but more importantly, that design is a product of self-awareness. Now, then the question becomes, of course, is God personal? Okay, well, that qualifies with the moral order of the cosmos. In a godless universe, or a pantheistic universe, or a solipsistic universe, or a nihilistic, well, if nihilism, then all moral systems should be more or less equal. We should see the civilization that says that theft is great will ultimately do just as well as the civilization that says theft is wrong. And what we found historically is that the civilizations, the populations that cleave closest to what we would consider God's laws are the ones that ultimately triumph and prosper. And the further we stray from God, the worse things get. Now, the counter to that Scott has traditionally used, is that can all be explained naturally. And my counter to that has been that you're just accentuating the fine-tuning argument. For example, free will. Last time I talked to Scott about this, he asked, well, what if we found a natural explanation for free will? And I says, well, you're just extending the fine-tuning argument. You're just arguing. You're just saying that where there are parts of the universe that are so magnificently designed that we do have free will through natural foundations. So those are the big arguments that I'm going to be starting with. I will go into more detail as we progress, but I think that's a really good place to start. Scott, all you.
Okay. So those key points were cosmological argument, the ontological argument, I guess the version that you had written, you were mentioning,
Mhm.
and the fine tuning in the moral argument. So I'll kind of go through my opening, which sort of addresses all that in a way, and I'll kind of improvise on it because you did start off and say a few other things I didn't know you were going to say. But I would say one of the best reasons why a personal God is unnecessary to explain the world is the availability of alternative naturalistic explanations for the origins and functioning of the universe, like life and consciousness and all the rest. For instance, like the scientific theory of evolution explains the diversity of life on Earth without invoking the intervention of a divine being, right? The Big Bang Theory explains the expansion of a universe without a need of a creator God. There could be some natural entity or being that existed forever. And then I think scientists call this a singularity, which is like just a placeholder term for when all the the breakdown of physics, like time and space and all of that, seems to just break down. We can't really measure anything beyond the Planck scales, but we know these things exist. We know that there's properties that exist outside of space and time that aren't necessarily personal gods, like a quantum field, for example. Virtual particles pop in and out of existence all the time. We can test with the Casimir effect how energy, unseen, unknown energies can produce interaction in time and space. So we do know that these things exist. So this would be a refutation to the personal God. Neuroscientific research has also shown, you mentioned consciousness. Well, consciousness, most of the consensus is that consciousness arises from the activity of a brain rather than being a supernatural phenomenon. Now, there are other alternatives, but they're still naturalistic and they still are embodied. So if you want to argue that cognition exists beyond brains or before brains evolved, that's fine. In fact, I kind of believe that as a pantheist and as somebody who researches this stuff all the time. But all of this stuff is purely natural and it's embodied. So there's no spiritual or spooky stuff involved in that. Science cannot, measure those things by definition. And furthermore, many aspects of the natural world, such as natural disasters, diseases, human sufferings, are really difficult to reconcile the existence of a all-loving, benevolent, personal sort of God, right? So the problem of evil and suffering raises serious questions about the nature and existence of such a deity. Under pantheism or naturalism, that problem dissolves away naturally because we can just say that it's amoral. The universe doesn't care about our opinions, how we feel. Obviously, evolution is a process that entailed a lot of suffering, creatures dying out, going extinct, and so on. So we see this as a property or phenomenon in nature. So I'm not pointing to something that doesn't exist. I think we can all agree on that. So overall, the availability of a naturalistic explanation, coupled with the problem of evil and suffering, divine hiddenness, all of these things provide a strong argument for why our personal God is unnecessary to explain the world. And I'll just kind of leave it at that for now.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So we didn't need to take up the 5 minutes. So that's good. Now we can go into rebuttals for each other's introductory statements. So since Alejandro went first, I'm going to let Scott go. And then after Alejandro, will go afterwards.
Okay, perfect. So he mentioned fine tuning, which it was entailed in a lot of other arguments that he had mentioned, like the moral argument, things like that in a way, appealing to some sort of moral realism would only, promote the fine tuning rather than argue against it. Well, let's define what we mean by fine tuning. The way I understand it is that fine tuning is a scientific term. So it's basically if you change parameters in some sort of way, you're not going to have life as we experience it. Scientists understand this. It's like there's a certain distance from the sun. Now, it's not as small. Those sort of distances or those sort of parameters are not as tight and on the edge as a lot of intelligent design proponents may argue for, right? What they're doing is they're arguing that this version of an apparent fine-tuning of the universal constants and parameters is evidence of an intelligent designer, like a personal God. However, the argument has been widely debated and criticized by, scientists and philosophers over the millennia, right? And here's a few ways that I might debunk the fine-tuning argument. I don't know. Let's see. We've got the multiverse hypothesis. So that's one way to challenge the fine-tuning argument put forth by intelligent design. Point out that there may be a large number of universes, each one with different constants and parameters. And in this case, it wouldn't be surprising that our universe has conditions necessary for life, right? It's all natural. You have to meet those parameters. It would be a miracle if the universe didn't look fine-tuned from life, and yet here we are. That would be a miracle, and that would actually evidence a God of some kind, like a personal supernatural God. But we don't see that. We see everything working among a natural cause and effect sort of thing. We also might be looking at the observer selection effect. So that's another way to critique this fine-tuning argument. Just point out that the argument sort of presupposes that we're observing the universe as it truly is without any observer selection effect, when in reality, science tells us there's an observer effect, in science and just in general. If the universe had been having different parameters, we might not even exist to observe it. So this means that the apparent fine-tuning may just be the result of an observer selection bias rather than an evidence of some intelligent designer, right? And then the biggest thing of all that I kind of find with this problem is the fallacy of composition. So fine-tuning commits the fallacy of composition, which is the assumption that what's true of the parts is also true of the whole. In other words, just because a certain constant parameter seem fine-tuned for life, it doesn't necessarily follow that the entire universe is fine-tuned for life. I mean, if you think about it, 95% of the universe is said to be made up of dark matter and energy, right? We don't see life there. In fact, that's just another placeholder term that scientists use to describe this phenomena that has effects on the world we can observe, but we know nothing about it. We don't detect any life there at all. So the fine-tuning argument is not universally accepted by science or philosophy in those communities. And we can simply use natural, refutations like multiverse hypothesis, observer selection effects, and the fallacy of composition and naturalistic explanations as well. As far as free will, well, we've been down this road too, and always maintain that libertarian free will is an incoherent term. I can't really conceptualize libertarian free will because it violates the principle of cause and effect, right? You have to have a cause. Now, if we drill down to the scale of molecules in someone's brain, you can easily see that we're determined by previous causes, biologically and chemically. That doesn't mean we don't have some form of free will. And I would say that our free will is better described as something like habits we form over time, character building, behaviors that we sort of pattern and create certain principles about ourselves. So if we learn certain things over a certain amount of time, then we can sort of direct how we want to go in our life. But even that is using the framework of determinism. We understand how the universe works and we kind of use that to exploit it. But at the same time, we're sort of acknowledging that and making decisions and choices. So tricky concept, but I'll just stop there. It's taking a long time. So, yeah.
All right, Alejandro, it is now your turn.
All right. So we're going to start off with with a little bit of common ground. Scott, you've indicated that you're a pantheist, okay? And pantheism is one of the four coherent worldviews. The four coherent worldviews that I went over in my opening is classic theism, God created the universe; nihilism, the cosmos does not actually exist; solipsism, which is everything is contingent on me; and pantheism, which is what you've stated to be. Now, the issue with pantheism versus theism is we're really just comparing which is the most probable of those four. Okay. Now, again, like I said in my introduction, the answer really is the explanation for fine tuning. However, I'm going to go ahead and take a step back on that because you indicated a problem with free will, with proper libertarian free will. And unfortunately, this is basically the cyanide pill of pantheism, because the easiest way to communicate the issue is that both of us are being equally rational. So if you truly believe there is no free will, then there's no point in debate. You believe the sun is blue, I believe the sun is yellow, guy over there says it's green, and there's really no way for us to establish which of us is correct. It's the thought version of the brain in the bucket. Okay, the brain in the bucket exercises we can't be sure of what we're seeing, classic matrix problem. But without free will, that actually extends to our thoughts. We can't be sure where our thoughts are coming from. So if you're going to express a difficulty with free will and continue to insist that you're right, your worldview has a problem right there that is not resolvable. Thank you. I'm going to turn off my volume too. Thank you for. So you found a problem with pantheism right there. The problem with free will. So that's basically death for pantheism. You're trying to explain free will, and free will the easiest way to communicate is, how do we know we're right? Now, if we do have free will, then we are considering, introspecting, why do I believe 1 + 1 = 2? Why do I believe murder is right or wrong? Why do I believe in voting Democrat? Why do I believe in voting Republican? We were actually considering these things rather than these merely being the result of chemical fizz. This is us being a meat robot. Someone is born and their genetics says you're going to grow up and you're going to be a mass murderer, and someone else is born and you know what, you're determined to be a billionaire. It's not up to you. It's just the circumstance of your birth. It's the position of the stars. It's who your parents are, which is where we get these ideas of feudalism and modern totalitarianism, where it's basically the accident of your birth. You're not culpable. You're not responsible, and that's where social justice comes from. So right there, your worldview has already taken a big hit that you need to resolve. Now, getting onto it, you've already admitted the existence of things beyond the scope of what you might call first-person observation. If you posit the existence of multiverses, you are positing the existence of things that you can surmise to be true, that you can infer to be true. And if you're going to infer those as solutions, I am well within my rights to infer the existence of God. So again, it goes down to which is the most probable. Now, in this situation, what is the simplest explanation? And that is a designer. So we can take it with the watchmaker argument or the cell phone argument. You find a cell phone in the park, okay? The simplest explanation is someone dropped it, okay? Now you can argue, trillions and trillions and trillions of universes have come into being and gone out of being, and we just happen to be the one where a cell phone, just assembled itself from random atoms and the fluctuations of the subatomic field in the park on your way home. Or you can say, yeah, someone dropped it. And again, if we're going to debate between pantheism versus theism, it's what is most likely, what is most probable. And again, you've already run headlong into the problem of free will, and then you've posited the existence of things beyond first-person experience. So right though, those are two very strong arguments that I think you got. I like your ringtone. It's nice.
I know my job keeps calling. I'm gonna turn this
Well,
off
you got to
here.
make money, guy. That's
Yeah.
that's the way things go.
All right, so an extra 5 seconds just to finish up because of that, and then after we'll jump into the.
I've said what I need to say. The only other thing I could address does not apply because he's a pantheist, and I'm going to honor his position of pantheism.
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
Okay, so now we can start with the 30 minutes back and forth based on the conversation thus far. So
Okay.
whoever
Okay.
wants to
Cool.
continue, please do.
Yeah, I'm biting at the bit to respond because you said free will would be a defeater for a naturalistic or pantheistic view, because, and I understand why you would say that. It sort of makes sense, because what it kind of sounds like you're saying is that, well, if you're determined, then how can you be having a coherent conversation? Like, how would we know who's actually telling truth versus someone who's not telling the truth, or at least reasonable or being rational? I do have a problem with ultimate truths as well. Not that I don't think it exists, but we don't actually always know what's true. But that's all beside the point. But the
Actually, no,
main
I can
thing
respond to
here,
that.
yeah, well, to get to the point is that if I go along with what you're saying, I would be giving into a category error. Number one, it would definitely be a category error, and it would be something that would be promoting a square circle. It would be incoherent, because we have this principle of causality, and we humans are part of that causal chain. So, like, for example, if you try to close your eyes and not think of anything at all, you can't do it. Thoughts are going to pop into your head. You have no control over that. You have no control over when and where you were born. Other factors like genetics, predispositions, things of that nature. So there are things that influence you. And so libertarian free will is the idea that individuals have the ability to make choices that are not, causally determined, or that have those sort of external factors that would influence their choices and behaviors. We know this is false. This is just stupid, because obviously, if you were born as a Muslim in a Muslim country, you're most likely to be Muslim, and the numbers indicate that. That's what the numbers determine. Same with Christian countries. The same with being a Buddhist or a Hindu in the Far East, for example. So we know that we're influenced by stuff. So I don't understand how libertarian free will is a defeater. I need you to kind of back that up.
Okay. Well, you're having problems defining free will. Now, we'll go ahead and work with the definition that free will is the capacity to choose between right and wrong. And that's broadly right and wrong, correct and incorrect, true and false, and everything else. We have the capacity to choose. Now, if we do not have free will, then we don't have that capacity. So, so to start with your starting point, someone who grows up thinking murder is great, they're born psychotic. They're born they're born, it's their DNA, it's the alignment of the stars, it's their astrology, it's Mars in retrograde, whatever it is, and they grow up to be murdered. But it's not their fault. It's ultimately not their decision to go out and be a murderer. It's not their decision to go out and be a thief. It's not their decision to set cats on fire. That's just the way they were born, and that's where you get social justice from. That's where you get this idea of being soft on crime, and where you get the idea of social justice. We redistribute luck from the lucky to the unlucky. Now, so now that we have a definition, so the definition is, are we being rational? We apply it to this debate. Okay, so if you're a pantheist, then pantheism obliges you, and you're saying you are, and you're saying you have a hard time with free will, then you're obliged to not have a debate. You're obliged to say, well, I am a pantheist and I believe this, and I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I don't know if it's, accurate or inaccurate. I don't know if my version of reality is the actual version of reality. But in the process of doing that, you're saying you're right. You're in the process of saying, I think chunky peanut butter is better than smooth. You're making a statement. It's kind of like the same way you have people who criticize the idea of being on the right side of history. This actually came up recently. There are people who believe, yes, there is such a thing as the right side of history, and I want to be on the right side of history. And there are people who criticize that idea. There's no, it's relative, and there's no real right side of history. There's no, linear progression of ideas. And at the same time, those people are saying it. They are saying they are on the right side of history. They are saying they are correct. So it's a self-refuting position. So you're basically at a point in your position where you're trying to be a theist, but not actually admitting it. So you're trying to have, your cake and eat it too. Does that clarify anything at all?
I understood what you're saying, and you're basically repeating the same claim essentially, because what you're saying is, oh, well, if you don't have free will, then while it might be in line with your pantheism, it's not in line with reality. And you're telling me that free will is reality. No free will is just not reality. That's imagination. But I'm telling what my position is that it's the other way around. Free will is imaginary, because what we do know is that we've only got two options here. It's either random or we have determinism, right? At certain levels of the universe, we know that it's random in principle. Now, you can say that there's a special ingredient that we can't scientifically measure called free will, this libertarian version of free will. But you haven't made the case yet. You haven't really shown me where this exists. Right now, I only see two things. I only see randomness and I see determinism. I don't see a place for libertarian free will. That's still, to me, hard to conceptualize. I understand you're saying that's where social justice comes from. People want to take responsibility for the woes of the world and behavior that people may exhibit. It's also the reason why we have jails and prisons, so you're not really against free will, actually. I mean, if somebody breaks the law, I'm pretty sure you'd be all for taking their free will away and putting them in a cage for life, depending on the crime.
You're ignoring the definition of free will that
Well,
I just provided.
Let me finish what I'm saying, though. What I'm saying
going
is,
to jail does not take your free will away.
well, it'll take their free will to keep on committing crimes. Is what I'm
That's
saying,
not their free
which
will.
is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
That's not free will. You're equating free will with doing whatever I want, and that's definitely not free will. No, so I just want to make sure.
You know what? That is doing what you want is sort of an argument for determinism, actually.
No, what you're saying, when you say
you have no choice.
Can someone in jail, if I put you in jail right now, could you still think clearly?
Yes, of course. You could.
You have
exactly.
free will. Okay,
No,
then you have free
yes,
will
you
in
do,
jail.
but not libertarian free will. So that's
you have
that's what I'm trying to get.
Free will because you still have the capacity to be rational in prison.
But what I'm getting to is that there's a difference between libertarian free will and compatibilism, which is another form of determinism, but it allows for rationalism. It allows for people to make choices. It's just that you're basing your choices on what you want, and your wants are informed, like I said, by your genetics, by your teachings in life, and so forth.
Okay, well, the problem with compatibilism is that everyone is equally rational. I covered that earlier in the debate. And if compatibilism, then you are being exactly as rational as I am, and debate is futile. So as soon as you try to convince me that you're correct, you're breaking your own principles.
Well,
if compatibilism, then you are being just as rational as I am, who's being just as rational as any random person on the street.
Well, tell me, what is define for me rationalism?
I did. The ability to choose between right and
wrong.
One
more time.
To be rational or to be logical? To be rational to me is to follow the will of God. Okay, that's being rational. Now, to be logical, that's you're following principles. Being rational, and who created those principles is God. Okay, so this is one of the things where having a God, when being theistic, makes everything else make sense. So you start off with an all-powerful creator who is all-knowing and perfectly good, and he authored what reason is. He decided what good and evil is. So when you are rational, you are doing what God wants.
Okay, well that doesn't follow,
Yeah,
because
because
you're sort
don't
of,
believe in.
well, what you're doing right now is you're begging the question here. You're assuming God in the first place, and then you're concluding God through this
No,
free will argument.
no. You asked me about what being rational is. Now,
Right. And you mentioned
so
God. So I'm just
there's no
sticking to that.
God in pantheism. Well, technically everything is God. So again, everything you do is perfectly rational. So you're
No, no,
basically
no, no,
having
no.
yes,
Not
compatibilism.
necessarily.
Everything you do is rational.
Well,
How are you
you
irrational
you
in
can
pantheism?
rationalism. So would you say that a worm is rational, or a
Now,
bird is rational?
as a theist, no. Okay, a bird, and you can make
I
argument
mean,
two
under
ways.
pantheism,
Under pantheism, you're just as rational as the worm is, because
as the worm.
both of you are influenced by both of, in both instances, your
I think I
decision
understand what
making
you're trying to.
is the
Yeah, you're saying
product
here.
of external forces. So
So
whether
being
you're a
rational
worm,
doesn't. So under just the. I don't mean to jump in, but just to kind of clarify what I'm hearing. Um, so being rational doesn't necessarily lead to truth under pantheism, but it always leads to truth under theism.
mhm.
Okay, so there's the claim that I would definitely disagree with. So tell me, how is it that being rational is going to lead you to truth? I mean, let's just say, I don't know if I want to say, well, yeah, under theism, go ahead, go for it. Tell me, how does being rational lead to knowing there's a personal God?
I explained that in my opening, but to
I
expand on
understand. We're just going with the
sure,
conversation. I can't remember like a computer,
sure,
unfortunately.
no problem. All right, so we start off with God. Okay, now the definition of God, like I said, is all perfect. Okay, so part of being all perfect is God is completely rational. That means his will is rational and we understand it through reason and logic. And reason and logic tell us what God wants, tell us what God is thinking, ergo the truth. And why is it the truth? Because God decided it. Okay, God decided that 1 + 1 = 2.
So did he determine us to be rational?
No, he gave us the capacity to be rational. People can be, in theism, people can be irrational. People can choose to be stupid. Okay, that's the easiest way to express it. Okay, um, uh, let's just pick on some people I know who make very bad romantic decisions. Okay, you can do the rational thing. You can be faithful to your wife, faithful to your husband. You can pick a partner who's going to treat you right. You can behave all kinds of ways which are what we would consider rational. And then we all know people who make choices that are ultimately self destructive and destructive to others. They can pick the wrong partner. They can choose not to honor their promises, both explicit and implicit, to their partner. And we would call that being irrational.
Okay. So let me ask you this then. Let's look at the empirical evidence.
Okay.
What empirical evidence do you have to reconcile the fact that our decisions are influenced by factors like genetics, environment, past experiences? How do you reconcile these findings with the idea that we have complete and unconstrained libertarian free will?
Well, it's like anything else, it develops. Okay. Not every,
So
now,
there's a point where you don't.
yeah, kids, for example, do not have the same capacity that we do.
So
I
what
mean,
determines the child to grow up to be free?
well, they grow closer to God. They develop as human beings. They develop consciousness. They're mentored. Their eyes are open. Now, again, this is something that we all run into.
That's a definitional problem though you have there, Alejandro. You have a problem now because libertarian free will is absolute free will with no influences at all. It's
No, I never argued that.
Well, then you're not arguing for libertarian free
I am
will, I don't
arguing
think.
for free will. I am arguing
No, for free will, right? Not
Right.
libertarian free will.
Now, I'm not really sure what you mean by libertarian free will.
Okay, there we go.
I think
Okay,
once again,
libertarian.
I think if I may, I think you're getting back to this idea of free will being, I don't have free will because I can't flap my arms and fly. I don't have free will because I can't jump off a cliff and survive. I don't have free will because I can't ride a bicycle and make it to 300 miles an hour. These are just straw mans. Like, oh, that's what free will is, and clearly
Yeah, that
that's
would
not
be
the
a
case.
straw man. I would agree with you. So that would be a straw man. So like I said before, I believe in a form of free will that I think we're kind of saying the same thing if you're denying libertarian. If you're saying that under theism, a child can grow into free will by getting closer to God, then we're actually saying the same thing. The more information you have about something, the more free will you're going to have, the more possibilities you're going to be able to behave in one way or the other. I think we agree on that. And I don't want to waste too much time arguing with something that we generally agree with, but I would definitely take, with this fine tuning and this anti-naturalism that you're promoting, it sounds like, and tell me if I'm wrong, please, you seem to be sort of like promoting necessitarianism, which is like a metaphysical principle that denies all mere possibility. There's only one way the world could be, and that's through God. You don't see any other possibility that doesn't include a personal God. Would I be correct to say that?
Well, we've already run into the problems of pantheism. Remember, in the beginning, I said there's 4 possibilities. Okay, so we're ultimately discussing which of those 4 is accurate. Now, we've kind of the problems with pantheism. Like I said, you have the problem of establishing free will. Okay, under pantheism, like you originally said, all of our decisions are the result of external factors, like the worm. Okay, the worm is not thinking, is it wrong or right to eat this piece of dirt? They're just doing it. A rock rolling down a hill, water flowing down in a river. They're not considering right or wrong. That's a capacity that we have and are designed to grow into, kind of like
so
we are
they're
designed.
determined, in your view, those sort of categories, worms, rocks, those are determined
planets,
things.
yes, motions of the planets.
So you're saying humans are especially free or more free than, say, an animal. And the more conscious we become, or the more sophisticated our consciousness becomes, then we have more mechanism to exercise some sort of free will agency. Is that what you mean?
That's true. And of course, you and
I would agree.
People.
I would agree.
But you don't have mechanisms for any kind of free will. You are always in that state.
But I do. I appeal to evolution. Evolution is how our brains have increased in size and complexity, and it's why we do the things you just mentioned. We don't just eat dirt blindly. We cook our food. We take precautions. We look both ways when we cross the road. We learn from our environment. We have theory of mind, so we don't necessarily. So we have empathy because of that. We have mirror neurons that help us to understand, put ourselves in another person's shoes, and feel sorry for people. Promote justice, social justice, put people in jail when they do wrong things. All of these things are human behaviors and human things. So I don't think we're really disagreeing on that point necessarily. We may disagree on why. You're just saying the reason why it's that way is because of God. And I'm saying the reason it's that way is because of some naturalistic property like evolution, a process. That's all I'm saying, is that probably the same conclusions you're coming through overall when it comes to this free will sort of thing of evolving and being more, have more access to information, kind of increases your ability to be free. I kind of agree with that and understand what you're saying. It's just that you're saying it's from God. I'm saying it's from nature. That's the only difference. What you need to do is rule out why nature cannot be that. And I would go so far as to say that nature is a better explanation than the God explanation.
Okay, well, number one, you're acknowledging the existence of immaterial forces at this point. You're acknowledging that there are things that are neither matter nor motion. Now, if that's the
That's
case,
science.
if that's the case, then abstracts exist absolutely. For example, and that leads us to the ontological argument. God is
What do
that,
you
than
mean
which nothing.
absolutely? Say, you said something. What was that?
Okay, so what happens is you've acknowledged the existence of things which are neither matter nor motion. You've acknowledged the existence of the abstract,
The conceptual, yeah.
the conceptual realm. And if the conceptual realm exists, then God exists per the ontological argument. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That is
Explain how.
something. Well, these concepts exist. For
So,
example, these. What do you mean so?
I mean, so what? They exist. We have concepts. Those are just
hmm
internal mental mappings of the world as we observe it. So how does that lead? How does that
Well,
follow that there should be God?
well, I think the easiest way to communicate this would be the existence of the continuity of self. And the existence of the continuity of self is the idea that, I look at you now and I look at you when you're a child, and there's absolutely nothing the same about you. Not down to the atomic level, you are a completely different being than you were when you were a child, and moment to moment you change. So for there to be a Scott Williamson, then Scott Williamson is not a material phenomenon. Scott Williamson is a self, is a soul. And so now we have the existence of souls, and we have the existence of a greatest, which would be God.
Okay. So my response to that is I just don't understand how no selfhood would be a contradiction neither to atheism nor naturalism, pantheism, any of those subcategories of atheism. Atheism is simply the lack of belief in a God or gods, and it does not imply any specific belief about the nature of self. Like selfhood refers to the sense of personal identity that we experience as individuals, and it's a concept, it's imaginary, and it's discussed in various philosophical and more like psychological contexts. So while some religious traditions like Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Islam, they may attribute the existence of the self to like some divine creator or a soul. There's also many secular or naturalistic perspectives that can account for selfhood without invoking supernatural entities. For example, some philosophers and scientists might argue that self is like the product of the brain's activity and its interaction with the environment. So they propose that some sense of self arises from complex cognitive processes like memory,
We're not talking about
attention,
the self, we're
perception.
talking about continuity of self.
That's what
Who
I'm
you are,
saying. This continuity of
that's very,
self,
very different.
but
Who you are now is
it's
a different
evolutionary
thing.
that it shouldn't be broken. The continuity should be straightforward. That's what the evolution would predict. And the reason why is it goes to survival mechanisms. If you don't see yourself as a constant self, you're not going to plan for the future. You're not going to make
Well,
decisions to protect yourself.
if I can address that point,
Mhm.
you've invoked nihilism and you've invoked that the self is illusory. So now you're into Buddhism territory. Now you're seeing the philosophical roots of it.
Yeah.
But if the self is illusory, then there is ultimately no observer. Okay, and if you don't have an observer, then you don't have anything. Then you have nihilism.
What is an illusion doesn't mean not real. You know that,
Yeah,
right?
just mean
An
no.
illusion is just, it isn't what you think it is. So there's an observer. I
Well,
agree with that. There is an
well, if
observer.
there's an observer and that observer is the same person or being or thing, moment to moment, you have an immaterial existence of a self. You
No,
have
it's
a
your
self.
brain. It could be your brain. If you damage your brain, that continuity of self might be damaged. Like you know, my aunt Emma,
Well, the
she's in
thing
the
is,
hospital. She doesn't remember who she was 5 minutes ago.
okay. Well, if I can address that, then you've argued that the consciousness not the conscious that consciousness is a product of the brain, and that leads you back to the hard problem of determinism. Because now what you think is the product of things that are not the product of an unwinding spring, the product of chemistry, the product of biology, the product of happenstance. It's not,
What's
it's
wrong
not
with that?
anything, it's not anything in and of itself. It's a post hoc rationalization.
Post
So,
hoc? I don't know. It seems like we've made predictions, novel testable predictions regarding theory of mind in neuroscience. There's a whole lot of research that you can look at, like
I'm
talk
familiar with
about that.
most of it. I'm
Yeah.
familiar with most of it. And the thing is that what you're arguing is an interpretation of the data. Um, Put simply, either the brain is the producer of consciousness, which is what you've argued, or the brain is the receiver. It is basically like what ear is to sound. Our brain receives consciousness. It's a bio antenna which links us to the cosmic all. Now, and again, the observable phenomenon would be virtually the same. If your antenna is damaged, you're not going to get the same signal.
So
The
how do we
signal,
tell the difference? How can we distinguish between consciousness from a brain and consciousness from some antenna or some signal that's hitting our brain like an antenna? How do we tell the difference between those two?
well, like I said, I've gone over the philosophy of that. I can go over the parapsychology of that, which is the existence of souls, the existence of ghosts, the existence of the
That's
paranormal.
appealing to other mysteries. I guess what I'm asking is what sort of empirical scientific evidence is what I'm asking for. Do you have any that you know of, like research that sort of indicates that the brain does not produce consciousness? And I would be fine with it because actually, I also believe that cognition happens beyond the brain, but that's still embodied and it's still natural and it's still based on scientific research. Has nothing to do with supernaturalism, has nothing to do with spirits, ghosts, and God. So I guess what I'm asking is how can you have mind that's not embodied? Like what mechanism can you point to, or what sort of empirical evidence can you point to of an unembodied mind?
Like I said, you're going into the paranormal realm.
I
You're
understand.
basic.
So,
That's the empirical evidence is, millions upon millions of videos of ghosts on YouTube. You're going to have to argue that every single one of them
I
is
got you.
false. And that's
I
a
got you.
huge issue. Basically sitting here saying, well, I'm right because I know for a fact that every single ghost encounter in the history of the human experience is wrong. Now, until you can prove to me that and you have good reason to know that every single video, every single personal experience, every single legend, every single one is false, I win this point.
Well, that would be a really bad thing for me to do, to make even that sort of argument that every
Yeah,
single
good.
every
You
single
have to argue that
story. I
every
mean,
single
not even just ghosts, but of God experiences of everything. I could never tell you that every single situation of that has a naturalistic explanation. I would be a fool to say that, and it would give me the burden of proof that I could never meet. So I agree with you 100%. But then what you're essentially doing with that now is you're making an argument from ignorance fallacy. So what that means,
how am I making an argument?
yeah. So what you're saying is I don't know that every video doesn't point to the
No, that's not argument
supernatural.
theory. That's
Therefore, it must be
statistics.
the supernatural, right?
No, I said that I'm making an argument purely on odds at this point. The odds are at least one is true. And if at least one is true,
Do
then so
people
be it.
lie?
Then
Do
go.
people do hoaxes?
Again, yeah. You know what?
Okay,
You can
let me
say
follow up
you
on
can say
that.
90%. You can say 90% of them are fake. You could tell me that, but you know
Right. So
what?
the
Only
odds.
10% are true.
Okay. So we're talking about the odds again. So here we go. If we know that every single case of unexplained mysteries everyone that was ever solved was solved with some naturalistic explanation, then it's just basic inference and logic to say that the next thing we see or the thing we don't know about probably has a naturalistic explanation too. That's just basic inference. That's not a white swan fallacy or black swan fallacy. To do that would be to do what you were saying I would not want to do, which is to make the claim that every single thing is going to be naturalistic because that's just what I'm predetermined or predisposed to understand. Gotcha. So I'm just saying white swan, blank. The blank is another white swan. Yeah.
So now we're going to go into the 7-minute ending. So Alejandro, it's your turn, and then it's going to go into Scott Williamson's turn.
Okay, well, the biggest one is free will, and we had a little bit of dispute over the definition of free will, and I'm going with the most important part of it, the most important part being that we can have a real conversation. If we don't have free will, we are not actually having a conversation. We are not actually searching for truth. We are just, farting with our mouths. Okay. The second, so right there, we have a failure of pantheism. The second one, which we just went over, is the observation that, okay, you asked for ghosts, you would have to believe every single one is false. Every single one. There is no, you can't make that argument. That's not an argument from ignorance. That is, odds are, hey, some of them could be faked, but you know what? There's enough out there to believe that some are real. And if some are real, then it does exist. And the best explanation for that would be rogue waves. For most of human history, we didn't believe the existence of rogue waves because we hadn't observed them. It wasn't until the end of the 20th century where we actually could measure them from oil platform and from orbit. So, we're in the same position where it's like every single one is false. No, it's safer to believe, which brings me to a point I wanted to make in closing, which is better safe than sorry. We have to look at what is conducive to good civilization. And theism is the answer that we have come to as a civilization, as a species. Thank you.
Alrighty, okay. That was fantastic. And Scott, please go ahead.
And before I do that, I just want to say thank you, Alejandro, for coming on and having this great conversation and debate. It's really lively. It gives me a lot to think about. And I enjoy these conversations, as you already know that. Mm-hmm. And anyways, let me get on with my closing. Basically, just to say that, yeah, we talked about free will, a little bit of a misunderstanding, talking past each other about the definitions of free will. Libertarian is just absolute free will with no possibility of influence, that we're just standalone, isolated minds that can behave and choose to think any way we want to. I don't agree with that. And I think Alejandro said he didn't either, if I'm not mistaken. But there is some form of free will where as we get more information and we learn more, we start making habits, we start exercising particular behaviors, and it becomes easier for us to do that. This is all sort of common sense. It's like learning a job, learning how to ride a bike, anything like that. So free will for me wasn't really a big issue for bringing down any one of our points, I don't think. But in the issue of, I think with the naturalism versus the supernaturalism or fine-tuning argument from a personal God, I just don't see that he's connected the dots. I mean, yeah, we can see order and stuff like that, but look, we're all prone to biases. Like you said, we all interpret the data the way we want to. That's the whole project of science, is to actually destroy as much bias as possible. So we have peer review, we have different ways that scientists are trying to disprove another person's hypothesis. I mean, multiverses, gods, singularities, quantum fields as the origin of the universe, they're all imaginary. I'm not arguing for any one of them. All I'm really saying is that God is just as imaginary as the multiverse idea, right? But I think that the naturalistic explanations hold a little more weight. And the reason why I say that is because they're built on things we already observe. They're built on things we know exist. We don't bring in brand new things that we don't have any proof of or evidence of, like gods and ghosts and leprechauns. We don't bring those into the picture because they're just imaginary. We bring in things like particles, energies, experiments, things that we can see and test and prove. So I don't think that you've actually refuted the naturalistic explanation as that alternative to a personal God. And then with the self, the whole selfhood thing, there's the same thing. I'm going to appeal to science and naturalism. There's naturalistic reasons, evolutionary reasons for why we would have a continuity of self. It helps our survival of ourselves and our species, and that's pretty much it. So I'll leave it right there. Again, love the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you both for coming on. Now we'll just go into the comment section, see what individuals have written. We'll do that for 15 or so minutes, and then after we'll end it there. So right now from Linear, we have one thing. It's more of a statement rather than a question, but she states, we've seen people making cell phones, though. We never saw any God making anything. So what would be your answer towards that question, or that statement, Alejandro?
Well, it's rational deduction. It's a principle. You see, the problem is that whenever I encounter this sort of argument or this sort of thinking, it's a refusal to understand how things work in principle. And this goes back to an earlier part of the conversation we had, where people are not developed to see things in the abstract in terms of absolutes. So, and the other thing is, it's a very solipsistic argument. It's like, you know what? I've never seen Roman armor. Or actually, no. Let's say I've never seen Troy. Well, then Troy doesn't exist. It's a very narcissistic, very solipsistic position to take. Most times I encounter this argument, it's in terms of when I'm making an analogy. And analogies are fundamentally flawed, but it's designed not to be an argument. It's designed to clarify a position. So, for example, the principle is it better be safe than sorry? And I say, well, if you find a gun, do you assume it's loaded or unloaded? If you find a set of railroad tracks, you're going to take a nap on it. And they're going to say, oh, well, I know trains are real. I know guns are real. Like, okay, well, you're just telling me you don't understand the analogy. And so to me, it's an example of what I talked about with Scott, about people not thinking in principles, not thinking in absolutes. Like, it's always better to be safe than sorry. And this.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
And that goes to another thing that I teased out in your closing, which is when you seem to think of reason as being your thoughts in toto. So, for example, you can have personal experience that says, I really don't like cilantro, or I really do enjoy the taste of cilantro. That's not what I'm talking about with reason. You can be influenced one way or the other, but that's including things that are not part of the set. So, yeah.
Okay, and Scott, actually, I'll send that statement up to you as well. So, what do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I would say that the thing about phones is, we're talking about validity, like what is a valid belief, and especially in the context of a conversation like this, you want to have common ground. So we can all agree phones are made by human intelligence. So we don't see that as controversial at all. And so it's not really a big stretch to say that I told him, look, I found a phone on the beach the other day, and it doesn't work, but I found a nice iPhone on the beach. What do you think, Alejandro? And he may say, or most people, I won't put him into it, but maybe a lot of people would say, I can believe that because I found a phone the other day too, just like that. Or it's not it's mundane. It's just a mundane claim. But if you say you went on the beach and I found a unicorn, then we're talking about something that's kind of pressing our credulity there. It's kind of stressing our credulity. And so such a thing like that, you're valid to doubt and be skeptical about those sort of claims, because they're two different categories. Now, as far as you were saying that, it's better to be safe than sorry, I kind of agree with you in a big way on that, because we have something in neurology and psychology called the hyperconscious detection bias. So there's an evolutionary reason why we do that. It's better to be safe than sorry. It's like if a guy was in the savannah and he sees a bush rustling. Well, is he going to sit there and be a scientist and try to explore it, wonder, well, he might not live to tell the story because there's a lion behind the bush. But if he determines, oh, there's probably a goblin behind that bush, I better run away. Or there's a god behind that bush, or an angry god, or a demon, or whatever, I better run away. Yeah, he might not be telling the truth, but guess what? He survived to tell the story. And so evolution sort of selected people that had this sort of hyper conscious detection bias in their minds. And so we all have that. So it's why we fall for magic tricks. It's why we fall for a lot of illusions out there. And we like movies and we like stories, because we have this bias going in our brain and that narrative all the time. So that's all I really want to say about that.
Oh, very interesting. We have another question from KCA Randy. I don't believe in a soul. What would a ghost even be? So this is going towards you, Alejandro. So what would you state based on this statement?
Well, I think honestly that Scott should answer the first question first, because he hasn't explained it at all. And
Okay.
not only that, and the other thing is that if he does not have a coherent explanation for observed or experienced phenomena, that is a strike against pantheism. Remember, it's not just saying that I'm wrong. He has to say I'm right. So if he hasn't, to my memory, posited any explanation for the historic and near ubiquitous paranormal experiences. The idea of souls, ghosts, and things like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, so this is a good point. And I would say that, again, I would never want to say that there's no such thing as ghosts or souls or anything like that, because I'd be talking out of my butt. I would basically be giving into my own, I'll be maybe like a normalcy bias or some sort of bias against anything I don't know about. So I wouldn't want to fall into that category. So I would just kind of say I don't know either way. It takes more investigation. And I actually look into stuff like that. I'm just an inquisitive person. I look into paranormal sort of ideas. So far, I'll be very honest with you. So far, I don't see a lot of that very compelling, although a lot of it is very interesting, like the NDE stuff and different studies like that. But as to the question, I don't believe in a soul. What would a ghost even be? I don't really know. It doesn't sort of I couldn't really envision how that would be possible. I just can't envision it. Maybe when I was a kid, I had a lot of imagination, but beyond that, I couldn't really tell you, what a ghost is.
Well, the thing is, I can observe that you can't, because there's no way a ghost could exist in a non-theistic paradigm. We've covered continuity of self. That's simply impossible. There is no continuity of self, so there can't be any soul. So you would have to argue that every single paranormal experience of that sort is wrong, because
Well, I understand.
no
I understand
you
that.
have to argue that there's no explanation other than people are wrong. Everyone, every single video.
I can understand why you say that, but I would also say this, that the universe has no obligation to make sense to us. That's what Neil deGrasse Tyson said one time, and it makes a lot of sense. The universe has no obligation to make sense to us. So, like quantum mechanics was laughed at when Einstein talked about time bending. The philosophers and the scientists said, well, that's a contradiction, because time isn't a thing by definition that we're all even agreeing on. So for For you to say that time can bend and it's a thing and it's physical is just a contradiction in terms. But then Einstein went and proved it. He made an equation, and then they tested it empirically. Now we have GPS systems and things like that based on that model. So we know that some things that we think at one time don't make sense actually turn out to fit perfectly with a better understanding of nature. So now nature isn't just this classical Newtonian mechanical old atheistic paradigm that a lot of theists kind of accuse atheists of being even till today. Now we know we have other realms of reality. Now we have realms of other dimensions in quantum mechanics where they go by different rules altogether. These rules even affect our cognition, our sense of smell, birds.
If I could jump in real quick, you've argued previously that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. So if the brain is dead, there should be no consciousness.
Under that theory, yeah.
That's what you're stuck with.
Well, there's a hard problem with consciousness. I'm not sure if you're aware of that one either, but
we covered that.
Well, you said hard problem with determinism, but maybe you meant consciousness. But yeah, there's a hard problem with consciousness under materialism. Now that's a whole other thing. Under materialism, consciousness has a lot of problems to explain, and that's why I'm not a materialist either. But I'm not. That doesn't make me a theist. It makes me a pantheist. Because there's things about nature, there could be unknown properties of nature. Just like in theism, there's unknown properties of supernaturalism. Like there's theists who couldn't tell you what heaven is made of or what God does every single moment of the day. What's his favorite color? There's things about theism even theists can't explain because these are unknown properties of the supernatural. They admit that. Well, it's the same thing with the naturalists. We'll say there's unknown properties of nature that probably exist. We know this is the case. Why? Because we learn all the time. We're always gaining knowledge. So this sort of indicates that we're never at a full knowledge of how reality works. We're always learning. And so ghosts, these sort of things could turn out to be correct. But if they turn out to be correct, my bet is on a naturalistic explanation rather than a personal God.
Okay, that was good. Now there's one more. It's another statement.
I can answer that question if you give me time, if you'd like.
I mean, go ahead. Absolutely. I just do want to get to this last statement, but you can answer that, and after we'll jump to the.
Go ahead and clarify it. I was a funeral director for 10 years, so I'm actually pretty familiar with this phenomenon. Ghosts are, well, I can answer it in scientific terms too. A ghost is a three-dimensional shadow of a fourth-dimensional being. Okay, so for example, when we as three-dimensional beings cast two-dimensional shadows, I can see the shadow behind you right now, Joshua. You are a three-dimensional being, and you are casting a two-dimensional shadow. A fourth-dimensional being would therefore cast a three-dimensional shadow. And so when we see these beings that are, black shadows that are three-dimensional, what we are seeing is a fourth-dimensional being. So what happens is when someone dies outside the grace of God, they wander the world as demons. There are two different types. There are male demons and female demons. Male demons have the capacity to affect what people perceive. So you can't find your keys. You misjudge the distance. There's a lot of little things they can do that make you perceive the universe different from the truth. Female demons can affect the way people feel. And when someone is infected with a female demon, they interpret everything around them as being hostile and directed at them. It's not just that the copier broke, it's that the repairman sabotaged it because you're, I don't know, blue-haired, whatever, because you're polka dotted. And of course, the way to prevent it is to not be immoral. My experience with ghosts is that they are attracted to immorality like flies are to shit. So if someone tells a white lie, if someone, steals, if someone does something like that, they might get away with it, but they might attract the attention of a demon. They might attract the attention of an angry ghost. And the ghost's tasks, what their reproductive strategy is to drag you further from God. They trick you into doing more immoral acts, and the more immoral acts you do, the further a person strays from reality until they're completely delusional. So,
Okay. Scott, do you want to reply to that any quick, or do you want to?
I would just be really interested in all the evidence for stuff like that. I mean, I'm not aware of it. So if you have any evidence for that or research that talks about that and kind of evidences those things, that'd be really cool.
The evidence is people who are detached from reality. We have plenty of examples right now that you and I can talk about till the cows come home, about people who are completely detached from reality. They perceive the universe entirely different from the way it is, and every action they do takes things from bad to worse. These are not rational people.
Right. I just wonder if there's some sort of experiment that can can tell us the difference between a ghost causing irrationality or some supernatural property that causes that irrationality like you're talking about, or the difference between that and just maybe people that are, brain damaged in some way. I wonder if there's a way to, I would just assume there was, but it's another conversation. I don't want to hold
Okay,
up.
well, we'll have that conversation another day then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing and the last thing that I want to bring up is, though this is a statement, is from KCA Randy, that isn't enough to organize my life around. So I think what he's stating was that when you stated you have to, it's kind of like Pascal's wager in a sense. You got to wager what is the better side to be on, either a theist or be an atheist in a sense, or a non-believer. And I think he said, well, what I'm hearing most of the time is not enough to move my life into a different direction. What would you state about that, Alejandro?
That's better be safe than sorry. I mean, this is something you really don't want to be wrong about. I mean, one of the things that I was prepared for is I was prepared for atheists, and there was even a comedian who did it to great laughs. That this is really not a decision you want to be wrong about. Theism is the default. Okay, this idea that I am not going to believe in God until proven otherwise. That's the same thing. It's like, I'm not going to believe the gun is loaded until it's proven otherwise. I'm not going to. I'm going to treat this electrical wire as having no current until proven otherwise. Well, that could go really badly. And so, when someone says that's not enough to organize my life around, well, you are organizing your life around something. And that's part of this debate that I wanted to be more clear about but didn't have time, is that each position has things that come with it. If you're a pantheist, there are things that come with it. If you're a nihilist, there are things that come with it. If you're a solipsist, there are things that come with it. And if you're a theist, there are things that come with it. And then the second part of that is, from that we can tell who is and who isn't. So if someone says, I'm a really good person, and then you say, and then you see they're setting cats on fire, it's my favorite stupid example, then you say, well, no, you're not really a good person. Likewise, if someone says, oh yes, I am, I don't believe in astrology, and they have their chart every day. If they say, I'm a really great Jew, but they keep none of the laws, you have to look at the evidence. And so
Oh,
yes,
go ahead.
that was it.
I would say that that sounds kind of like an appeal to emotion. It's kind of like, well, the danger in not believing, we should be fearful of that. So that should be our default there. So it's like if we see a gun on the table, we don't play around with it. We might hurt ourselves because we have this rational fear that we might actually hurt ourselves by pulling the trigger. The difference is, with that analogy, is we know guns exist and we know bullets are in guns, and we know that these things cause.
That point.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, still, I don't see how appealing to an imaginary origin story should invoke fear to the point where we base our life around it. Now, like you said, and I agree with, everybody interprets things different. I already even mentioned myself. that we have this hyper conscious detection bias within us. So we have that fear naturally. We have this object permanence that we get when we, when we're babies and we grow up into this idea that there's this extra world out there and that it has some sort of consequence. And all these fears are sort of built in naturally for naturalistic reasons. It's log story, but I just don't see how we can therefore it must be true type of thing, because we also know that the thing rustling behind the bushes could be more.
I'd like to answer this, respond
Sure.
to that point. Okay, number one, this is not establishing that God exists. We're talking about whether or not it's good to believe. The second thing is this means that the onus on you is to come up with an explanation. I'll go way out of my way and say, okay, so you think leeches are not the cure to disease. Okay, let's just throw that out there. You think, leeches is a terrible idea and we shouldn't do it. And the question immediately then is, okay, well, what's your idea? I don't have one.
Right.
Okay, thank you. I'll take the leeches. Okay. I would even accept someone who could be honest enough and say, well, I think it's better if we don't leech them. Okay, well, we can compare that. But someone who just says, you know what, I don't think you're right. It's like the example you cited earlier. It's like, the world is full of tornadoes and natural disasters and people get struck by lightning. Okay, great. How does atheism solve that problem? How does pantheism solve that? Guess what? It doesn't.
And it's not meant to.
Well, then you're whining, and it's not even a valid criticism.
It's not whining, Alejandro. What it is we're talking about philosophy. So we're talking about what's true, what could be true versus what isn't true.
Right. And so far you haven't offered anything.
Yes, because guess what? Nothing. Pantheism, atheism, naturalism isn't designed to give you that explanation. It's good for nothing. I'll be honest with you. Atheism is only good for escaping out of religion, if you want to say anything like that. Maybe there's some harm that you can get through organized religion or believing things that aren't true or that have no basis in reality. Atheism might be a vehicle for that. But I also want to tell you, too, that religion exists for a reason and spirituality within people exists for a reason. Again, I appeal to naturalism. I would say that people are spiritually minded, believe in God, form religions and tribes and all of that stuff out of a utility, and it served us very well. So you're very right about that sometimes believing in certain things help us survive, like the rustling bush analogy I gave, right? I agree with that. I'm right there with you, brother. But what we're talking about is we're kind of digging deeper. We're going beyond the emotion and we're going into the logic of it. The great thing about us humans is we can sort of separate, at least temporarily, the emotion and all of that kind of stuff. And we can just talk about just the logical, how we connect the dots, the epistemology, And so when I look at theism, personal God claims, epistemically, it has no connection that I'm aware of. That's all I'm saying.
If I can.
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay, you have this idea that pantheism and atheism are something that are not. Okay, I've informed you that, you don't have an explanation for ghosts. You don't have an explanation for free will. You don't have the explanation for a lot of things. And that's something that I find is a real weakness on the part of non-theists.
So we should make something up?
Well, you have to acknowledge what naturally covers. Now, you said...
So you're arguing to make up answers for things we don't know?
I'm talking about what is logically consistent.
Okay.
This is not an appeal to, emotion here. This is me saying what comes with pantheism, what comes with solipsism, what comes with nihilism. Just saying, well, I don't like theist answers. Well, that doesn't tell me what your answers are. That's like the classic, I think, Steve's car really sucks.
Irrelevant. I don't understand the relevant. Why would you want to know that? Like, that seems so irrelevant. Like, why should atheism, pantheism, naturalism, why should any of that stuff explain these sort of questions? I don't understand.
Because if not having answers is worse than bad answers.
Or maybe having no answer to those things until we have evidence would be the best thing to do.
Well, you're not acknowledging the reality is that there might be no answer, which would be incomplete. So,
No, I'm not saying there's no answer. There's an answer to everything. But what I'm saying is we don't necessarily know about it. I brought up epistemology. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. So it's how we know things. So if you're going to make a knowledge claim to say there's a personal God, and these are the reasons why, I'm just not seeing the connection. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you're not true. I'm not saying it's not true. What I'm saying is I don't see in your argument the connection. I see what you're saying. I understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, but they're just not connecting. And that's why I keep asking over and over.
okay, so what do you think comes with being a pantheist?
It's just the idea for me. It's just the idea.
No, it's not
that the
with
same
you.
thing
What
that
is
a God. No. Let me give you my answer. I don't want to parrot what the dictionary says. I want to parrot what Scott Williamson thinks. And pantheism, another thing I also want to be clear about is it's just a label. It's just a word. Words have usages. They're not set in stone. Okay. They're not prescriptions. They're descriptions. So anyways, when I think of naturalistic pantheism, it's just to say that in the God topic, everything that God, the supernatural God being, the personal God can explain, naturalistic pantheism can make the same explanation, only better. It appeals to nature rather than some personal mind behind it. Because, and I'll tell you why. And this has to go along with that fine tuning argument that I wanted to get into, but I didn't want to go too long on it. Maybe this is a good chance to do that. When we start positing a personal God with a mind, with love, intention, care, volition, free will, all these things, that thing is more complicated than the universe he created. So because the universe is so complicated, it needs fine tuning to be the way it is. I understand that. It makes sense. It does make sense on a certain level. Here's where the problem comes in. If you're going to say that you needed a fine tuner, well, who fine-tuned the fine tuner to make the universe the way it is? It's just an infinite regress.
I get what you're trying to say, but we should focus just on the questions, and then after we can come back to no worries, and we'll come back if we want to have another debate. We can make another debate based on fine tuning, and I think that would be really cool. So the last one before we actually end, because the time we only got 4 minutes left. So it's from Linear again. So it's a three-parter. So the first one is that she states, I guess I must be super moral because I've never had that experience. I guess that when you were talking about ghosts and demons, and plus, let alone she's an atheist as well. So being an atheist and everything, never had these experiences before, she's saying that she must be extremely moral because she's never had any said encounter. The other thing that she states is that, and since religious people seem to have more supernatural experiences like that, maybe they're the least moral after all. So I guess what she's stating is that maybe, and I'll shoot this question to you, Alejandro, again, is that if religious individuals are the ones that keep having these type of experiences, and individuals who are non-theist aren't having these type of experiences, might that actually show, not necessarily that they don't exist, but might show that maybe the theists in and of themselves might have the wrong formula?
Well, it's been my experience that most hardcore atheists are possessed. I say this from from easily more than a decade of experience, that atheists spend all their time arguing that the proper conception of God is one who A, did not create the cosmos, and 2, is evil. And that in Christianity, as Judaism and Zoroastrianism, describes the adversary, or what Zoroastrians call the Anger Manu. So when I talk to a lot of atheists, they are blind. They are not the authors of their own thoughts. They are very hostile. And it really does strike me as many of them are possessed to one degree or
another. Interesting. Scott, is there anything that you would like to say about that too, or do you want to?
It's just a claim. It's another claim that he's making here. And again, I'd have to see the evidence. Just there's a lot of bad people in the world. There's a lot of hostile people in the world. theists and atheists alike. So I don't see how that proves anything. It's just a claim. So I don't know where to go with it.
Well, I can do a follow-up debate with that because we're out of time.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing is that she also states that lots of religions have hell as well. So maybe the belief system that you might have might not be the real belief system which is out there. And if that deity believes that you believe in the wrong deity, then maybe hell is awaiting for individuals even that do believe in some sort of theistic God. It's the wrong theistic God. What would you say about that?
That's the argument I just made. They're atheists go on saying God is evil. You see, she's literally just done exactly what I say atheists do. Is that atheists go around saying God is evil. So clearly, God has damned everyone except people like me, which you might recognize as the hell and brimstone pastors from a generation ago. I don't know if either of you are old enough to remember them, but a lot of these, my church is saved if you believe the Bible exactly the way I do. Everyone else is going to hell. That is classic old school fire and brimstones pastors, and those people have evolved over the last few decades into the modern atheists, and Linear is doing exactly that. Everyone's going to hell. God is evil. God believes in slavery. She's doing exactly what I hear basically every atheist say. And
I would respond to her, and I would say that the way I'm reading her is saying that some religious people like Hindus, Islamists, and certain fundamentalist Christians alike would say that Zoroastrianism is a demonic religion. I've heard that. Matter of fact, I've had a discussion about 4 months ago with a preacher who told me to stay away from Zoroastrianism because it was a demonic sort of thing and they're going to hell and all of this kind of stuff. So I think what she's saying is that you've got different theists who can't even agree on what you should be careful about. Like, don't take a chance and not believe, well, which God are we talking about? Because you've got the Islamics, the Muslims who would believe that Christians are going to be burning in hell maybe, and other religions that oppose them, and vice versa all across the board. There's Hindus that would say the same thing about Christians and everybody else. So, and then not to mention Muslims, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons.
Exactly. And let alone, I might have stated it or stated her statement in the wrong way generally. So if that is the case, Linear, I do apologize for that. That was not my intent to state it wrong.
Yeah, that's how I read it.
At the same time, just right now, as she stated, I didn't write God is evil. I don't believe in God exists. So I don't believe it's evil or good. It's a non-existent. But your belief system doesn't make you safe with your logic. So I guess all she stated.
She's saying God is irrational, tribal. She's saying that God is, doesn't take into account what people do. She's making a lot of characterizations, Scott. She says
other religions will say that. Other religions may say
other religions.
She's not saying that. She's saying other religions.
Well, she's parroting that point. Okay, if other people say that, that's great. What does she say?
Well, what she's challenging your logic. So if you're saying that,
no, she's not. She's telling me what other people say. If she wants to,
say, she's telling what other people say.
That's fine. And she can bring them here, and I will talk to them. But I want to know what she thinks.
Right. I'm just saying the way that I see what she's saying is that she's saying that there's other religious folks who would tell you that you should stop believing in the God that you believe in so that you don't go to hell. So they're making the argument that God is kind of evil and all that.
Grass is green and water is wet and the sky is blue. Your point?
Yeah, so she's saying that to kind of challenge your logic.
No.
I think she is. I'm not saying she is.
Either she believes it, okay, in which case I would respond to her point, or she's just saying other people believe that, in which case, hey, great, you know what, when they get here, I'll talk to them.
Right. That's what she's saying, the latter. That's all she's saying. And it's challenging your logic, though, because you're saying to be safe than sorry. So it's kind of like the Pascal's wager problem.
No,
Like
that's
which
a
God?
horrible version of that's a horrible misstatement of the Pascal's wager, because the atheist is going to be wrong no matter what. Okay, you know what? Let's just grant, for the sake of conversation, that there's a million different gods out there, and I just happen to pick Ahura Mazda. Guess what? There's a chance Ahura Mazda exists. The only way the atheists win is if none of them exist, and you have the same problem that you
You're
had with
wrong. You're
paranormal.
wrong, Alejandro. You're wrong, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why you're definitely wrong here. I was just watching 3 videos of indie ears who said they died, went to heaven, spoke directly with God. And you know what God told them? He said only the atheists and the unbelievers go to heaven. Because you know why? Because he wanted to test people on earth to see how critical and skeptical and how serious they took the matter. And he designed the world where God is hidden, God is not found easily, and there's a lot of confusion in the world. So it's a big test for them. So according to their direct experience after they died, they said that their God told them that atheists, and they were all Christians, all 3 of these people, they said it was atheists who were the right ones, and they're the ones that are rewarded. No one goes to hell. They didn't say anybody goes to hell. Everybody eventually goes to heaven. But what they were saying is that the ones that God rewards and that God is proud of are the atheists. So how do you know you're not? How do you know that you're not worshiping the wrong God? Maybe you should be an atheist.
I can answer that 2 different ways. Number one, that's one of the tests in Kabbalah. That's one of the things they warn you about. They warn people in Kabbalah that there are entities that will come to you pretending to be the good guy, and they're not. They're there to
How do you tell the difference, though? That could be part of the confusion that God's putting on the earth that they were mentioning. That religion is here to poison the well and make everybody confused, and only the ones who take time out and back out of all of it and say no religion, no God, those are the ones favored by God. And that's what's helping souls evolve
basically,
in the world.
Muhammad, you're basically okay. Muhammad said the same thing. Okay.
Okay. So how do you know you're not worshiping the wrong God? You're taking a chance.
I told you, no, I told you rational. Okay. I told you early on that God being perfect is perfectly rational. So I know if something is irrational, it is not of God. That's how I know.
How do you know that?
How do I know what?
That God is perfectly rational.
It's part of being perfect. I'm not going to worship a being that is not rational.
Well, how do you know he's rational and perfect? That's the question on the table. How do you know that?
You asking a
You're just saying
question?
it. You're just saying God is.
You self-refuted. You're asking, how do I know what is rational? You're asking me to be rational. It's like
no, I'm not asking how do you know you're rational. I'm asking how do you know that God is rational and perfect? How do you know that?
Well, that being rational. The Anger Manu is not rational.
How do you know?
Not rational.
You keep saying that, but
not rational.
How do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that God is rational? Like, how does it follow because you said that or you read it in a book that must be the truth? That's what I'm getting at.
Now we are getting to the point which I mentioned earlier, where a lot of people who don't believe in God are arguing that God is not rational. That's what they're arguing. That's what you're arguing right now.
Well, how do you know? I'm not arguing anything.
No, you're not. A question. See, that's the problem. That's how
Alejandro.
That's how
I'm asking a question.
No, you're not. No, you're trying to argue that God is irrational.
No, I don't believe in this God. So I'm not arguing for or against it. What I'm saying is, what I'm asking you, it's an internal critique. I'm asking you.
It's true, but we can have this internal critique next time.
Okay.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening in. Thank you both for being such great debaters coming on to our show and really showing our first debate. So thank you. I really do appreciate it. Again, I need to apologize for Linear for not reading her statement correctly. So that's on me, and I do apologize for that. And for the next time, I will see you. Actually, before I go, any last statements?
Next conversation.
Okay. Now, I will have to say to everybody, thank you so much for coming on, and I will see you next weekend on the Atheist Uprising.